right, thanks. We good? All right, cool. Well, thanks everyone. That's actually really helpful to get a little bit of the background and see what everyone is doing and thinking here. So I will kind of actually hit on some of these topics as we go through. This is one of those things, I don't use PowerPoint ever. So when I am forced to, then it's sort of like, oh, I put that up on the screen. So here we go with slide number 2. Let's see what's on it. Let me tell you, I guess, a little bit of background because it wasn't on the slide. I thought maybe I did. Anyway, so I'm Mike Palanski, and I'm an associate professor of management in the Saunders College. And for the last almost 2 years, along with Bob Barbato, who will be speaking in a couple of weeks, and Zi Tong, we've held the Miller Chair for International Education, which is a rotating chair that rotates around the colleges of RIT and with Saunders' turn. So we've had the privilege of doing a whole bunch of things over the last 18 to 24 months with respect to international education. One of the things that I really focused on was trying to strengthen some collaborations that we already had going on with our international campuses. So being in business, we're kind of in a unique position in that we have a presence at all of our international campuses, except the one in Kosovo, but even there's still a little bit of a connection there. So big presence in Zagreb with RIT Croatia, and in Dubai, and now in Weihai as well. And what's interesting is the program in Zagreb, the International Business Program, is actually the 5th largest program at RIT. So for the Saunders College, the international collaboration is really big and really important. So I've been able to use some of the resources from the Miller Chair to strengthen some of those relationships and expand some of them. So that's kind of the background for what we were doing here. So I teach, among other classes, organizational behavior, which is kind of the intro to management class in business. So organizational behavior is the scientific study of people in the workplace. So we talk about things like personality and motivation and teamwork and decision making, organizational culture, leadership, all the people stuff with work. Now the interesting thing is that within that class, part of the material for the class is learning about teams and team learning and how teams function. So we're in a somewhat unique position in that what we're doing is also what we're studying, which may not be the case for other disciplines. So there's kind of a unique perspective there. For years, I have run a team-based project in the organizational behavior class with a couple of variations. Started off just as a typical in-class project. Usually it's centered around having students find a TV show, usually a 30-minute sitcom, watch it, and then analyze what happened in the show according to organizational behavior theory. So the concepts that we're learning in the class apply to that. So very applied learning. Sometimes we do a small case study, but it's kind of that team-based project. It's kind of fun. Students enjoy it, but they get a chance to work in teams, and we spend a lot of time talking about what happens in those teams, the team dynamics, what do you do with the slacker that inevitably appears, and those sorts of things. For most of that time, I have tried to, whenever possible, do this project or a version of it in a virtual environment. So I've partnered with other universities within the United States. A good friend of mine that teaches on the West Coast, and we've combined our classes in years past. I have some friends that, actually 2 friends that work in the UK, and been able to partner with classes in the UK. A friend that until last year was in Ireland, so we did it with Irish University. And so we've had a variety of these different collaborations. I've also done similar projects in other classes as well. So I did one in a business ethics class with RIT Croatia. So I'm talking about the organizational behavior version, but it was certainly amenable to other classes where we weren't specifically learning about how teams function either. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background. And by the way, small group here, so just jump in with questions or comments at any time. Anybody have any? Yes.
About the virtual team project.
Yeah.
So what is important for your students about having those virtual team projects, even in classes that aren't looking at teams?
Yeah. Let me get to that in a minute. I think I did put it on a slide. And since I went through all the trouble. Yeah.
Just briefly re-voice questions for the recording.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. She wanted to know about what's important about the virtual team project. And I said, I'll get to it later. Okay. All right. All right. Very good. And if I don't, you remind me. You will not let me off the hook. So I'll tell you about the project and hopefully answer that question in the meantime. So that brings us up to the main event here. So last spring semester, spring of 2017, I did a version of this project, working with the TV show with RIT Croatia and my partner, Dr. Maja Vidovic. So we had around 110 students at each campus. I was teaching a super section of organizational behavior, and Maya had, I think, 3 kind of regular sections that she was teaching all of them. So we had 220 students divided on 49 teams. So this was already kind of a bigger scale. In years past, when I had partnered up with my friend on the West Coast, it was usually kind of one OB class to one OB class. So we're talking about 30 to 40 students at each one, maybe 20 teams, 25 teams. So this was already kind of double that size. Okay, so Maya and I met because I went to Croatia a few years ago, and Sean Sturgeon, who was the associate dean there at the time, works for us in Saunders, said to Maya, "You really need to have lunch with this guy." She's like, no, I'm way too busy. He's like, "No, you really need to sit down with him." And we did, and we immediately hit it off here. So I have a quote from Maya that we put together for hopefully what will be a book chapter in a book that David Martins and some others are doing about transnational education here at RIT. So this is from that draft there. When I initially met Mike, we immediately clicked regarding our approach to students and teaching. And the excitement of finding a kindred spirit was an awesome push towards collaborating to build a daring student learning experience. With hindsight, this connection proved to be the critical component of a successful student collaboration project. So I got my little Post-it notes here. Again, no PowerPoint genius here. Work with people you know and like. This is probably the most critical component to making these types of projects work well, is having some sort of connection, at least with your partners on the other side before you start. Now I have done it. The business ethics project that I had mentioned a few years back was with an RIT Croatia faculty member that I didn't know, and actually I didn't even meet until I went over a couple of years ago. She was recommended by someone else. It worked fine, but it wasn't nearly as much fun. And in that situation, I think what made it work was she kind of graciously said, "I've never done this before, you have. I'm going to let you take the lead. You tell me what to do, and I'll do it." And so it worked out well enough like that. But it wasn't a collaborative project. It was sort of me running that project with some partnership. On something this complex, that personal connection was so important, because we'll see a little bit more about this a little bit later. Just the amount of time and the number of challenges that arise, and just the ongoing work that it takes to pull something like this off means that you should have a good relationship and actually like one another, because you're going to be spending a lot of time together. So that was quite helpful there. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. All right. So fast forward to this past spring 28. Yeah, we went a little crazy and expanded the scope of the project. So we had Maya was still teaching her 3 on-campus sections of organizational behavior, as well as an online section. So she was doing 4 sections of the same class. Over here we had Joy Olabisi was teaching one of the sections. Joy is an associate professor in management, but at the time, actually right at the end of this project, she found out that she'd received tenure. So she was, I guess for all intents and purposes, tenured at that point, or at least on her way out the door. So she was kind of in a nice position where maybe the pressure was off by the time we got to running that. Michael is a long-term adjunct for us in Saunders. And it was one of those things where I kind of went to both of them and said, hey, we want to do this project. Wouldn't this be fun? Don't you want to do it? You know, kind of nodding the whole time. Joy had given this project to her years ago, same with Michael. So they had done versions of this in their own classes. They were familiar with at least the in-class version, but again, this was at a whole different level. Jenna had worked with us as our recruitment coordinator in Saunders, but was also teaching as an adjunct. She taught an online section in this, but right before this class started, she got a new job and she moved to Richmond, Virginia, where she's working in a similar capacity at Virginia Commonwealth University. Michelle, who's also a great friend of mine and was the person until last year that was in Ireland. So we had done this project together before as well, but had recently just moved back to Oakland University in Michigan and was teaching 2 larger sections of organizational behavior. Michelle is very accomplished. Had she begun her career at one university, she would have been tenured already. But she moved back to the States and starting as an assistant professor. She's going to be absolutely fine. However, was at a new university. I kind of talked about this project during her interview process, and they really liked it. So the pressure was on there as well to show that, hey, this is a good thing. Maya, whom you've already met, Maya is a superstar at RIT Croatia. She's won the RIT Croatia Eisenhower Awards for teaching. She's just fabulous there. But as one of the best professors there, she's also very popular, extremely in demand, and has a lot on her plate as well. And the system there is a little bit different. She's a lecturer, which would be akin to our assistant professor role, but again, also there's not tenure in the way that we do that. I mention those things because there were a lot of dynamics given the fact that we had someone going up for tenure, a long-term adjunct, somebody was an adjunct but teaching online. It used to work here that didn't anymore. Someone who was at a new university and somebody who was at one of our other branch campuses. And then there was me. I dubbed myself for purposes of the presentation as the project manager. I was the Miller Chair. I was the only tenured professor among this group. And oh, by the way, I wasn't actually teaching any of these classes in the spring. All right, so I was just kind of coordinating this whole project. So it was an added layer of complexity in that not only did I want the project to go well for the students and for the purposes of the research project we were running on this, which I'll talk about in a moment, but I felt a certain level of responsibility for everyone else because, I mean, I had the easiest job of all, right? Tenured professor, not actually teaching any of these, Miller Chair. Easy for me to say, yeah, go out and take a risk, and when there are student problems, it's going to come to your plate first. All right, so there was a little trepidation when we did that. But you can see there, now we had 322 students on 93 teams. So this was a really big project that we ran. Any questions? Yeah.
Was there a goal that you wanted to reach with that size of a group? Were you going for like 1,000, or were you like, Why did you scale up to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple of reasons. One, sorry. Why this size? Why so many people? Why did we scale up to this? Number one, we were collecting data along with this to do some research, and we wanted a larger sample size of teams. Team research is notoriously difficult because you never have enough teams to to be able to look at anything statistically, but 93 we thought would do it. So there was that. The other thing was we wanted to include Michelle and her students at Oakland University for two reasons. One, she's my friend. She had kind of promised that we were going to do something like this. Now, she had other outlets. She could have partnered with her old university in Ireland, but this was the easiest path forward. So wanted to include her. But we also wanted to see what would happen when we had a US-based student here and a US-based student there, so coming from the same national culture, but two different universities. And just to kind of see what would happen with that added dynamic. So we were kind of curious to up the complexity a little bit too.
So the teams were comprised of students from all universities, not necessarily within the section. So on a single team, you have somebody from Oakland, somebody from Croatia, somebody from Ireland.
Yeah, so right, so the ideal team, so the question was what was the composition of the teams? The typical team would have included a Croatian student, a Rochester student, and an Oakland student. Sometimes we had to put two Croatian students on to balance the numbers. And in the online sections, we just decided to keep the online students kind of separate. So most of the online teams were two from Jenna's section and two from Maya's section. Again, with some adjustments for to balance everything out. And we found some interesting findings on that, which I'll also touch on. Right. Any other questions? Okay. So let me give you a little overview of the project here. So as I mentioned, we were collecting data along the way because we wanted to see, does this type of project actually make any difference with respect to learning? So right at the beginning of the semester, we did some baseline surveys, so individual level surveys for students. We collected some basic demographic personality type things, but we were really interested in three main questions. Question number one, would this project increase the students' efficacy for working in a cross-cultural environment? We decided to focus on student efficacy because, well, it was a little bit easier to get at, and also there's a lot of research that shows that someone's efficacy about finishing a task has a direct relationship to their ability to actually do that. So, so it kind of made sense. So would it increase their cross-cultural efficacy? Would it increase their efficacy about working in a virtual environment on a virtual team? And then the third thing was, basically, did they like it? Were they enthusiastic about it? Not that that was the most important thing, but we've all taught here, and if students are jazzed about it, things tend to go a little better. So we want to see that they like it.
So your three questions are focused on the individual learner, right?
Yes.
What about the kind of meta performance of the team as a unit?
Yeah, so we weren't too concerned about that, although I guess we did collect that information based on how well they did on the project. And the short version is all of the teams did really well when it came to the finished product. So there wasn't a lot of variation. And I think the reason for that is, at least on this project, there was a lot of hand-holding, a lot of coaching, we're basically not going to, you'd have to just not do it in order to do well. Because there was just so many iterations. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have background data on projects that were not virtual, were not between cross-cultural?
No. Yeah. So the question was, do we have similar data on not virtual, not cross-cultural? In other words, if we just kind of did it in a normal class and see what would happen. Yeah. No. No. But it's something we could get, going forward. Not a bad idea. Any other questions? All right, so we started with those baseline surveys. We had this kind of pre-project time. One of the challenges that we found was that Oakland University started something like the Monday after New Year's Day. So they started very early in January, whereas RIT started a couple of weeks later. So we had already this shift of calendars, and the calendars not lining up. So we wanted to capture that baseline data before they started doing anything in the class, because the class touches on cross-cultural elements, especially the online sections are going to be working in a virtual environment right from the beginning, and that may have had an effect. So we want to kind of capture what their baseline was on day one. We surveyed them again right before the project itself started, so roughly a month later. Took the same surveys looking at the efficacy and so forth. They had sort of a pre-project in which each team needed to do a team contract. So this is one of those things that I think can help anybody that's running this type of project, regardless of the subject matter. We have the students get together. We gave them a bit of a template about what to do and what to talk about, but we had them create a contract for the team, talking about things like, what are your individual expectations for this project? What do you want to get out of it? What are your goals? How is the team going to function? When will you meet? What methods will you use? What happens when there are problems? Problems not understanding the assignment? Who's going to take that to a professor? What happens when you have a team member or two who aren't performing, who promise something and don't show up? How are you going to deal with that? So it's a great way to talk through those potential issues before they surface. The other nice thing is it's also kind of an icebreaker exercise. It forces them to start interacting before they are talking about the project itself. So we did the team contracts, had the contract due, and then we took a week off before the project actually started. That was RIT's spring break. So right when we came back from spring break, that's when the project itself officially kicked off. We had it phased out over 4 weeks, and they had a deliverable due halfway through, where they had to do a rough draft of the paper with certain sections in it to get some feedback. But also along the way, at the end of each of those 4 weeks, we had each of the students do an individual level reflection paper. And it was very structured. We gave them a couple of questions to work on, sometimes about the cross-cultural aspect, sometimes about how the team was functioning, to help encourage the kind of the metacognitive learning about teams as they're going through it. We also collected some data at each one of those time points, so we'd have some longitudinal data over time about their level of enthusiasm and so forth. Project was due. We did post surveys at the individual level, and then graded and returned everything. All right. 2 points here. One, you can kind of see there was a lot of structure involved with it. And that's one of the lessons that we learned. I have a nice little post-it note that we'll get to in a second, that it takes a lot of structure, a lot of planning, everybody's got to be on the same page. Yeah.
One thing I'm trying to envision in all this, so you have these mixed groups,
Mm-hmm.
RT, Oakland, Croatia. How did you tell the students what vehicle they would use to interact, or was it kind of like, okay guys, you can FaceTime, you can use a Google Doc, you can whatever? What did you tell them?
Yeah, great question about how much did we specify how they should interact with one another? We gave them a spreadsheet with, here are your team members, here are their email addresses, good luck. Now, we had on the side, we had some best practices. Here's some things you might want to try. email is good for some things, it's not good for others. You know, check out WhatsApp, try a Skype call. You know, some usual suspects. But we did not specify how they ought to interact. And that's one of the decision points in this project and in any project. It has its pluses and minuses. Some students I think learned more because they had to figure it out themselves. I think some students struggled because of that as well. So,
Did
yeah.
you collect data on that component of it? You know,
We
how well?
do have we have some open-ended questions from the surveys about how did you interact, and actually in the paper, the last page of the paper was how did your team interact. So we haven't coded that or looked at it, but yeah, we do have it to see if maybe that has an impact. Yeah, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
So you had a fairly large group deliverable at the end of some sort?
Oh, right. So it was so they.
I'm asking.
Yes. So they had a team deliverable, which was basically a write-up of the TV show that they picked and analyzed according to the concepts from the class. So we had I think it was like a 9-page paper they had to produce as a team.
And did you make any attempt, and were they aware of this, to distinguish the individual contributions to that and have grades reflect that in some manner?
Not on this project, unless they specified it in their team contract. So the question was, did we account for individual contribution to the team project, right? In projects past, we have kind of baked that in and required them to do peer evaluations and adjusted kind of the team grade based on the percentages of peer evaluations. On this project, we mentioned that that's a possibility, but it was up to them, and if they chose to do that, they'd have to write it into their contract. And that the professors would enforce the contract, but would not be the arbiters of who contributed what.
Did
Yeah.
any teams do that?
I think maybe one team did
Out of
so.
93?
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Another one of those decision points, similar to how much do we specify which modes to use, whether to do that or not. Yep. I will say, I bet there were some teams that thought or wish they had done that afterwards. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you'd be enforcing the student contracts.
Yes.
Logistically, how did that work? And what sorts of things did you find yourself enforcing from the contract, or was it just the threat of enforcement?
Yeah, so how and when did we enforce contracts? Because it was such a large group, we stated that when they had kind of 2 points to do this. When they submitted their final paper, if they knew that there was something in the contract that would be relevant, to make note of that. And then, actually, that was the only time we did it. I was going to say after they got their grades back, but we didn't even allow that. We just said, if you know that you had put into your contract that somebody was going to have their grade adjusted in some way, you need to make note of that when you submit the final project. And then we'll go look at the contract, make sure it's legit, and then we'll enforce it. Yeah.
So maybe you're going to show us soon, but let's say one of the faculty members from RIT was one of the persons involved in the group, and they had 30 students enrolled in their class. So would they be responsible for like 7 groups for their grades, or how did you divide up the responsibilities for grading and assigning and things like that?
Yeah, so the question was how do we do the grading, basically, and how do we define responsibilities? So we had each professor responsible for their students on the individual level reflections and so forth. And we set that up so that it was basically an all or nothing type of thing. If a student completed that week's individual deliverable, they would get full credit for it. So we were also able to have some grad assistants just kind of go through and spot check those. So we had help with that. When it came to the final deliverable, so we had 93 papers. I randomly selected 3 of those papers. All of us graded all 3 of those, and then we had a reconciliation meeting to make sure that we were looking at things the same way and agreed on those 3. Then we divided out the remaining 90 papers. I did some of the grading, so 15 roughly for each of us. graded those 15 as individual instructors, and then just took the scores for those and make sure that they were consistent across instructors. We also gave the option that if anybody had a weird paper, they're just like, I don't know, that they could bring it back to the group and we could talk about it. But I don't even think we had one of those. So, yeah.
As a follow-up to that, so
Mhm.
did you have a common My Courses course where there was a Dropbox that all the faculty could see and use?
Yes, sort of. All right, so this is a great question about how do they submit the deliverable where we're using My Courses. This turned out to be one of our biggest challenges. It was easy enough to set up a master My Courses shell that all RIT students could use, including the ones in Croatia. However, we could not include the Oakland students. Well, we could, but it would have cost $10 a student to add, and nobody had $800 in the budget to add them to RIT's My Courses. We did add Michelle to the RIT My Courses, so at least she could go in and look. This turned out to be one of the biggest challenges and complaints from the Oakland students, that they felt like they didn't have equal access to the information, that they were dependent upon their RIT team members to both submit and then also to give the feedback. In fact, it got to be such a problem that Michelle went in and downloaded all of the feedback and ended up basically setting up a shadow learning management system at Oakland to mirror what we were doing at RIT. So one of the big lessons that we learned is, when we do it this spring, we're going to have to solve this problem, is we need to figure out a different repository for the deliverables that everyone has equal access to, whether we use Dropbox or something like that. Yeah, great question. Any other questions? All right, real quick, here are the results from the research on it. So we're basically looking at from time 1 to time 2, controlling for that baseline. We did show an increase in student efficacy in working in virtual environments, which was gratifying, except that only applied to the on-campus students, did not apply to the online students, which kind of makes sense because they're in an online class. They're already doing this stuff all of the time anyway, so we saw that effect go away. We did not see a significant increase in efficacy in working in a cross-cultural environment, which was at first a bit surprising. What we realized was, or what we think, and this is one of the things when we run it again this spring, we're going to change things up a little bit, was that the project itself really didn't require much in the way of cross-cultural collaboration. It was, everybody's taking an organizational behavior class. Almost every team picked an American TV show, which of course everybody watches. Everybody knew The Office. I mean, right? Everybody in the world watches The Office. They analyzed it, they wrote it up, turned it in, and that was the end of it. I mean, some teams, of course, did go to a deeper level. Many did not. So when we do it again this year, we're going to either change the assignment itself or change the parameters about how they interact to force some cultural exchange and see what happens. And then we did see, we saw an increase in enthusiasm, a slight one. What was interesting was the Croatian students started more enthusiastic and ended more enthusiastic than the American students. We have a couple ideas behind that. Our guess, and that's all it is a guess, is that it's RIT Croatia. We market it as, you know, an American university. You're getting an American-style education. You know, you're a campus of RIT. You've been around, you know, for forever. And they really love any time they actually get to talk to the home office and interact with American students. I think that sort of validates, oh, this is why I'm here. And so I think they were more enthusiastic across the board. Yeah. So kind of interesting. All right, let me go on here. Okay, so I've kind of alluded to this already, but lesson number 2, coordinate a lot. Right? It was definitely, it's challenging. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It takes a lot of effort, especially when we had so many moving parts. But even when Maya and I were doing it with just the two of us, it requires some planning. It's project management, and it's a little project, and it needs to be treated as such. One of the challenges that we ran into that was most frustrating, and Michelle kind of talks about it, when students would come with a question, naturally they would go to their own professor and ask a question. And their partners on the team would go to their professor, and sometimes they were getting conflicting information. And this was frustrating because we talked at every meeting. We talked about likely issues that would come up. We talked about issues that had come up. We would work through it, make sure we're all giving the same thing. And at least the perception from some students was, no, we're getting different pieces of information. We had one faculty member of the team where most, in that person's class, was where most of these types of issues seemed to surface. This was also a challenging dynamic. And it kind of goes back to my role as sort of the project manager. My role as the guy who talked everybody into it. People were nice enough to go along with the project, but how much then do you push and say, you know, there's problems and you need to get with the program a bit more. I think in retrospect, I could have done a better job from the beginning of being even more clear with expectations of, hey, I'm going to be the project manager for this. I'm going to do a lot of the behind the scenes work. I'm going to coordinate everything. But if you sign on, here's what you're agreeing to. And the rest of us sort of have override to what you're telling your students. And look, at the end of the day, it's your class. For the final grade for the class, you are the instructor of record. That is completely in your purview. I mean, if you decide at the end of the project that this was a disaster and you want to bump everybody's grade up a third of a letter grade, more power to you. But until the project ends, we speak with one voice. And trying to figure out how to do that and do it well, it can be a challenge. Yeah?
Would it help to have some sort of thread where whenever you're approached as an instructor with questions, you say, this is what I was asked, this is what I answered, that you could all see, so that more in real time you're finding out what people are saying?
So the question was, we have a kind of a common area or a common thread that we could answer these at least more quickly. Any one of us would get a question that we hadn't faced before, we would email the group and say, I've been asked this. Here's what I'm thinking of saying. Is everybody okay with that? This is where email was a shortcoming. This time around, I think we will use River or some other system where we'll have that. It'll be in one thread. It's a place where we push notifications. So hopefully we'll get at least a few of the others responding, if not instantaneously, then more quickly. And then we'll also have an easy to find record of how to handle those. So yeah. Okay. Any other questions there? All right. Okay, so we've kind of hit on some of these considerations here. How hands-on, how hands-off, which gets to things like how much do you specify the technology that we use, how do we handle student questions and so forth. Certainly the scale of the project. This was probably too big for an ongoing thing, but that's okay. And we had sort of a different purpose for this. One of the goals here is to make this part and parcel of some of the courses that we teach. Our introductory business course, this organizational behavior course. We're going to be doing some things in a leadership course that I take. In order to make it stick, I think it has to be less involved. So there's some scalability things there. We just talked about being on the same page. The virtual teamwork. Okay, so back to Rebecca's question. We finally get back to, well, why do this? What's the virtual component? And and I think this is what would apply to the rest of you that, that are thinking of using this, is we really wanted to impress upon our students the importance of and give them experience in actually working in virtual teams. Because any sort of knowledge work is going to include virtual work at some level. You know, whether it's talking to somebody else across campus or across the country or on the, the other side of the world. We have had students in the past, and we had students during this project. Before the project even ended, Michelle had a student that came back and said, hey, I was on a job interview yesterday, and they were just kind of asking what kind of teamwork skills I had. I said, well, yeah, I just happened to be working on a virtual project with students from Croatia. Yeah, I didn't like it. I had to get up at 6 o'clock this morning to make a meeting. And they're like, right. And that's what we tell the students, because they complain. Like, oh, the time zones don't line up. Yeah, it's exactly why you're doing this project, all right? You're going to have to get up at 5 o'clock and get on a call once in a while. And it's not fun. Nobody really likes it. But guess what? This is the way the world works. And you're already putting yourself ahead of the pack by having this, this experience. So they don't like it, but it's definitely a stretch assignment. So that was kind of the impetus behind it. Does that answer that question that you asked earlier? Great. And then the last thing is learning assessment, which I kind of talked about the way we schedule it or set it up, but always keeping in mind, what exactly are we trying to do here? Is it just a fun, different experience, or are we actually trying to teach them things through this pedagogical approach? All right. So lesson number 3, yes, you will have temporary work spouses. It's a lot of work to be done well. It's a lot of setup work. It's a lot of collaboration while the project is going on. It's not onerous, but it takes some planning, and it takes some getting on one another's schedules. It's not a wind up and release. It's an ongoing thing here. Jenna, who is the absolute master of organization and making sure things get done and the trains run on time, had some advice here. But I think the last two are the most important. Transparency and accountability are key. Just being open and honest, and then being kind to one another and yourselves. It's you have to take time to laugh a little bit and enjoy what you're doing, because there are some intense moments for sure. Okay. Oh, by the way, there are students involved in this. So lesson number 4, it is about the students. This is sometimes we lose sight of this, which is kind of crazy since we're running a project with 300 and some students. But just remembering to look at it through the eyes of the students and understanding the importance. One of the beautiful things about this is all of the frustrations that the students are experiencing, we as instructors are experiencing in the same time. And so it's a great learning, it's a great lesson for the students, but it also builds a lot of credibility too, to be able to stand up in front of the class and say, so you're a little bit frustrated with your team members and having to get out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning and having Skype cut out on you because it stinks. Guess what? We're experiencing exactly the same things. And we've been doing this a lot longer, and we know a lot more, and we like each other a whole bunch. I mean, Maya and Michelle, especially, are 2 of my very best friends, period. So we still get frustrated with each other when we're working on these things. So, dear student, it's okay. This is part of it. Right? Okay.
Mike,
Yeah.
So as I'm reading Joy's comment, and it says, hearing students navigate through. When I saw that, I was thinking she's talking about hearing students, and then she's going to say something about deaf and hard of hearing, and then I realized I read it wrong. But I'm assuming that you had deaf and hard of hearing kids in some of these sections. Did you notice were they, because it was a virtual team, was everything accessible? Were there no unique glitches for the deaf
We
students?
did have
or-
some deaf students. So were there any differences for deaf students? We had a few deaf students in some of the sections. I don't recall that there were being any major issues as a result of that. If memory serves me correctly, I think that they just use a lot more text-based communication than face-to-face, which as we know is kind of one of the neat things because it levels the playing field in many times, which is kind of cool. As not only for deaf students but also for anyone whose English is their second language, which most of our Croatian students. Yeah. Any other questions here? Okay. All right. Lesson number 5. Oh, Sorum, yeah.
Question about mix of students in Croatia.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that some of the students were US-based students. So students were, I was kind of wondering how good their English was in Croatia. Is English first language, or are there students who are still learning?
Yeah. So in general, I don't think English proficiency was a problem at all. The Croatian students are fluent in English. Sometimes the written English is more of a struggle for them, but let's face it, that's a struggle for many students. No, the other dynamic that we don't think about at first is, so I've kind of used these interchangeably, but I should have stuck to US-based students and Croatia-based students, because a lot of the Croatia-based students are not Croatian. There's many international students at RIT Croatia, including Americans. And I mean, the same holds here and the same holds at Oakland. We had Chinese students and Indian students. And so sometimes what you end up with is a really unique dynamic of kind of, 2 people in 4 cultures, right? There's the, there's the Saudi Arabian student who's studying in Croatia, interfacing with the Chinese student studying in the US. Becomes a big mashup for sure. Yeah. All right, so I think the most important lesson here is have fun. I hope I didn't paint an overly onerous picture here. It takes a lot of work, but it's really a lot of fun. We had a good time working together, even when we had challenges. And I asked Maya, since we've partnered on the most, if she wanted to say a few words, for this presentation. This is what she had emailed me, especially this last part here. Collaborating with you on these projects has been the highlight of having international campuses, and I wouldn't change that for the world. And I feel exactly the same way. This was just so much fun. It's so much fun getting to know other people and working with them, and being able to extend impact as a professor to students all around the world, and then seeing the students grow. There's just so many good things that can come out of that. And then here's a few outtakes for your viewing pleasure. This was actually one of our follow-up meetings here where the screen froze because whatever we were using that day, Skype or Zoom, froze. I'm like, oh, I'm going to grab the screenshot. So yeah, that pretty much says it all. Like all the facial expressions that's kind of the full range there. And last spring, Maya was able to come here and visit, and I love this picture because we took that picture and then she posted it. She's looking at that, we're right in front of the tiger statue. It's like, hey, this is one of those pictures of, 2 idiots happily enjoying life a second before they get devoured by the tiger behind, right? So, yeah. So we ended up, getting into a lot of fun trouble there too. Questions, comments?
I hope you'll join me in thanking my
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for coming and asking your great questions. I am here as a resource for any of you or any of your colleagues. I just think we have done the hard work at RIT. at least for business. It's easy for business because we're at all of our different campuses. I know some other disciplines are as well. We've done the hard work. We have international campuses. Now we're trying to figure out how do we better collaborate, or when we're doing with our partner universities, Malmo and the others, or if you just have a friend you meet at a conference that's at a different university. And you're like, oh, we should do some work together. This is a great way to start. A great way to start. Even if you don't do the research part of it, it's fun. You get to work together. You get to kind of check each other out and see if this is somebody you could partner with at a deeper level. Yeah.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Let's change one variable. If you were doing this for an undergraduate population, what, if anything, would you change?
So this was for an undergraduate.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Beautiful.
So nothing. I would change absolutely nothing. Yeah.
Mine has it, so I thought it would be was a graduate.
Yeah. Undergraduate. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.